When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Welcome back to the History of the Papacy podcast, an Agora Podcast Network member. This being the Christmas season, what is a better gift from the history of the papacy to you than doing a show on the Cadaver Synod? It's kind of appropriate. The Cadaver Synod was held in January 897, so we're coming up on the 1122nd anniversary of this momentous event in papal history. This episode is a sort of ghost of Christmas future because the times of the Cadaver Synod is the transition from the Byzantine-dominated papacy to that of the Western European-based empire-dominated papacy and the so-called pornocracy, which all of these events will come up, hopefully, in the podcast before Christmas of 2020. Now, to put the bow on the present, I have a special guest joining me today, Dr. Max Gulker of the American Institute for Economic Research, to talk about the economics of the Dark Ages and the Cadaver Synod. Thanks so much for coming on, Max, and suggesting the show topic.
Oh, thank you, Steve. It's a thrill for me to be on and talking about what I consider maybe the weirdest thing that's ever happened in recorded history. I don't know. It certainly has to be in the conversation.
It's really, I think people see at the end of this, it's so bizarre, so strange, and there's not a lot of reason why it happened.
Right.
But I think that's what we're going to get into.
We're going to try.
Max, can you tell us a little, or do you want us to call you Dr. Gulker?
No, please don't. Okay. Max is great.
Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, well, so I am a senior research fellow with the American Institute for Economic Research. We are located out of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, which is like little corner out of the way Western Massachusetts. We have over an 80-year history of really trying to educate people and think about how markets work and why we need them and that sort of thing. A couple of my colleagues have been on with you, Steve, and Phil Magnus and Jeffrey Tucker talking respectively about the Salamanca School and church music. And I will claim responsibility for that. I am a big fan of history and history podcasting and the Catholic Church, too. And I discovered your podcast probably about 18 months ago or so. I was a little late to the game, and I was catching up. And one day I heard you talking about the economic reforms of Diocletian, and you started the episode by talking about how much you love economics, kind of similarly to how I would talk about history. And then you threw in a few names and some favorite economists that I thought, wow, he would really love the kind of work that we do. So I reached out on Twitter, and you said you needed a historically minded economist for an episode. And if you've heard Phil's episode with Steve, you will see I certainly produced that. And then you got Jeffrey talking about Gregorian chants and church music. So after all of that, just to tie a bow on it, I knew I could get myself on the show at some point. I didn't have any particular area of expertise, but this has been something that's always fascinated me in sort of a, macabre / just what on earth is happening kind of way. And so I thought this would be really fun to do. And so it's really great to be here.
Oh, thanks. And definitely thanks for coming on. But this topic is pure gold. Yeah. Pure Christmas gold.
It's the big 1122nd anniversary, right? I can't believe it's not getting more play in the media.
I know. Hopefully, maybe this will change things.
Yeah, hopefully.
Now, the basic background of the of this Cadaver Synod is it happened in January of 897, and basically Pope Stephen the Sixth, who is also referred to as Pope Stephen the Seventh, he's the host and the head prosecutor of the Cadaver Synod. There's a confusion with some of the numbering of the popes, especially the Stephens. A Stephen was elected pope in 752 who died before he was consecrated. And in the old customs, he wasn't counted in the papal counting. But then in 1975, that rule was changed, which screwed up the entire numbering of the Stephens, which it really adds a degree of confusion, especially since there's two Stephens in this whole Cadaver Synod situation.
I'm sure wars were fought in like the 12th century about the numbering of Stephen and something like that for decades or something like that.
The Stephens aren't so bad. The Johns are terrible. Yeah. There's 20-something odd Johns, and there's anti-Pope Johns. The Stephens, they are confusing, though. So we're going to be talking about 5 and 6 today. I may go back and forth, but it'll be pretty clear once we get to the Pope Stephen of the Cadaver Synod which one we're talking about. And then Pope Formosus, he's the Pope who's the accused, who we'll get into. A little bit of background, because if you're listening and if you're caught up with the podcast, we're talking about the mid-600s and the end of the 600s. This episode will fast forward to the mid to the end of the 800s. So just to really get you caught up and up to speed what happened in those 200 years, we're talking about in the 600s, the Byzantine-dominated papacy, where they started in the early to the mid 600s, and the connection between the papacy and the Byzantines will break in the 700s when the Byzantine Empire lost a lot of the areas that they controlled in Italy. Then other powers came in and filled in the gaps, like the Lombards, the Franks, the Germans. Charlemagne is in there. Pepin the Great was actually one of the first popes to be crowned king of the Franks, and he was crowned by Pope Zachary in 750. So that's a really big jump. And then a really important thing that happened in the 200 years or so between the end of the 600s and the end of the 800s is something called the Donation of Pepin, which gave the Pope's political power over central Italy, which would become the Papal States. And I think, Max, you're going to talk a bit about that, some of the power dynamics in that. Then in 800, Charlemagne is crowned emperor, which is a really big deal. Eventually, in that whole time period, Charlemagne's empire would be split into 3 parts: the Kingdom of the Germans, which would become pretty much more or less modern-day Germany, Kingdom of the Franks, which would become France, then the Kingdom of Italy, which was kind of a little sliver of area between the Kingdom of the Franks and the Kingdom of the Germans. That was the area north of the Papal States, which would become Switzerland and northern Italy, which that whole section of the former Charlemagne Empire was really a mess and a hodgepodge of political entities and really confusing area, which would make a real mess for the papacy politically. The popes of Rome during that time period faced a lot of problems. They had some theological problems. Innovations like the filioque were introduced. The church became highly Germanicized, which interestingly didn't push a lot of German culture or language. It really Latinized the church and pushed out the use of the vernacular, and it also homogenized practice, where there was a lot of diversity of practice, and they really tried to stamp a lot of that diversity out.
So the Germans, that's really interesting. Sure. So the Germans were sort of the ideological purists in the early Middle Ages.
Yeah, they're the ones, and that's going to become an issue today with the Cadaver Synod, is the politics of trying to get everybody in the West to do the same thing is going to be a part of the trouble, what gets Formosus in trouble. Yeah. There's a lot of politics going on, mainly the Germans, who become much more of a political player in northern Italian politics. And then the really great internal politics inside of the city of Rome between the powerful families. They're not quite the families that you would hear of in the Middle Ages, like the Colonna and the Orsini, but those guys they grow out of this period. Then there's a lot of stuff going on, and I'll go through this really quickly. The papacy kind of had a spheres of troubles around them. The immediate ones were the Germans and the Franks to the north, who they were constantly involved in political affairs. Then you had the duchy and the kingdoms of the Lombards, who were more so to the south, who they were really trying to fight back against the Franks. Then you had the groups, I don't know if it's politically correct anymore to call them the Saracens, but everybody calls them the Saracens. They're the Islamic Arabic armies who had, in the 700s, conquered basically everything in northern Africa and then into Spain. They had, by this point in the 800s, had a foothold in southern Italy. So not only could they attack by sea, they would also raid by land. And they were really great raiders. And that was really bad news for the papacy and for the Lombards. Then, believe it or not, the Vikings were actually were still going. This was like prime Viking time, and they did some raiding into northern Italy, but their big thing was that when they would push in on the Franks and the Germans, that would reverberate down to Italy, all the different the ways that the Vikings had weakened northern Europe. And then there's another group called the Magyars, who were from the steppe. They're kind of like the grandchildren of the Huns. And that was another one that they sometimes would raid into Italy, but their big thing is that they would cause trouble that, again, would cause ripples into Italy. And then the 800-pound gorilla in the room always was the Byzantine Eastern Roman Empire, which they weren't involved as much in direct secular politics in Italy anymore. But again, they could do things that would cause ripple effects into Italy. They were particularly forming political, cultural, and religious bonds with the Slavs, which would make another issue. So this is really one of those periods in history where little tiny things reverberated. This is where the Middle Ages and the early modern periods really getting established.
I'll say something here about to keep in mind maybe as we get into the Cadaver Synod about the power politics here. This is I used to, people will often say things that, as I've learned a little bit about the Catholic Church, I've learned are not true at all, such as the Catholic Church never changes through time. And now I'm thinking to myself, well, this started with the throne of Peter, but at least presumably, right? Now we're 900 years later and we're up to the Cadaver Synod. Now, what on earth has this thing has changed a lot. Now it's changed a lot, I would argue, for the better since then. And, one thing that's happening that we have to remember is this institution, the Catholic Church, is evolving with the power politics and the institutions around it, right? So it kind of grew up almost piggybacking in a way off the Roman Empire. Western Empire goes away, and now we have all these fractious groups. Now, if you're the Magyars and you want to influence events, with the Franks or something like that, how are you going to do that? Either you're going to, mount up an army and go fight a war, or you're going to use the infrastructure that's left in the Catholic Church, and you're going to, want to influence the church to have influence over the rest of Western Europe. So this makes the papacy and influence over the church more of a prize, maybe, arguably. And we'll see what people are willing to do for that prize in a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think especially the Cadaver Synod, but all these different things, everything we're talking about, carries over throughout the entire. This is where the Middle Ages and the early modern periods being created. There's another great podcast out there who's I've spoken to many times and is a friend of the show, is the Wittenberg to Westphalia podcast, and his podcast is eventually going to be about the Wars of the Reformation. He's spent, I don't know, but probably about 20 of his episodes talking about this time period, and people are like, oh, why are you talking about the 800s when your podcast about things that are happening in the 1500s? But this period, almost 3/4 of a millennia earlier, is laying all the groundwork that's going to happen in the early modern period, and which is really affecting us to this day. You could almost say that World War I was the last shootout of things that were happening in the 700s and the 800s.
So this is classic history podcasting, to start 800 years before your thing that you're going to talk about.
Exactly.
That one's actually on my list, thanks to you. So I will get to it.
It's a good one
day.
Maybe let's talk about the lead up. Now that we've sort of set up some of the pieces, let's talk about how we got directly to the Cadaver Synod. And we don't have to go 800 years back, but we just maybe a decade or a couple of decades back to Pope Nicholas. And he reigned from 858 to 867, and he's the last pope. There's only 3 popes called the Great: Nicholas, Leo, and Gregory, and he really was pretty good. He took a really strong hand in both secular and theological controversies, and he stood up to all of these powerful figures. He stood up to the Carolingians, the Lombards, the Byzantines. He pushed and punished bishops when they went against him, and he really accumulated and centralized a lot of power under the Pope. He really took on the Byzantine Empire big time, too. And something that's going to make a big deal with the Cadaver Synod, he sent emissaries to convert the Bulgarians, who were a powerful Slavic steppe tribe that had settled somewhere fairly much in the area of modern-day Bulgaria, so the eastern end of the Balkan Peninsula, which was really, that was prime-time Byzantine sphere of influence. And Nicholas sent emissaries there to convert these Bulgarians who were still pagans but interested in Christianity to Latin Christianity and pull them out of the Byzantine sphere of influence. Believe it or not, Constantinople didn't take very well to that. And they considered, like I said, the Bulgarians completely in their sphere. So to get a little tit for tat, Constantinople sent emissaries to Moravia, which is, it was a Slavic kingdom, but it's more or less modern day Czech Republic, at the same time that the Latins were sending their emissaries to Bulgaria. And this area of Moravia was very much under the German papal sphere of influence. And as you can imagine, it got the Germans really angry. We'll get into this situation in the podcast in a lot more detail later. But so you get that with this, it's almost like the Cold War where the Russians would send they'd try and get like the Cuba under their sphere of influence, and then we'd send missiles to Turkey, and it's like just trying to like horn in on the other guy's playground.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's funny you mentioned the Cold War, because you had mentioned the First World War a little bit ago, and I was thinking it was reminding me a little bit of the First World War and just the web of treaties that everybody's got with everybody else, and if they attack you, I'll attack them, and sort of everything's kind of sitting on a knife edge, if you will. The sphere of influence thing, I think, is important and may suggest the Cold War there, but it's really interesting. Yeah, for sure. And then another situation that happened is they would also, the patriarchs, the religious leaders in Constantinople, who are the leaders of more or less, they were the leaders of the Eastern Roman Empire Christianity. You can't really say they were the popes of the East, but they had a lot of sway over what was going on in Eastern European Christianity, where the popes were
at least the figurehead of Latin Western Christianity. So they would oftentimes try and get advantage of each other in religious political events too. There was a situation in Constantinople where there was a patriarch who was basically kind of like their pope, their head bishop. His name was Ignatios, and he was somehow connected to the emperor of the Byzantines, and he was kind of a nitwit. He was not the sharpest tool in the drawer, and he was not somebody who should have probably have been the head of anything, let alone the head of the religious apparatus of the empire. And in the modern parlance, he was trolled by this guy named Photius, who Photius eventually, through machinations, got Ignatius kicked out as patriarch. And it was a really unusual situation, the way Photius had done this. Pope Nicholas condemned how Photius took over as patriarch, and he excommunicated Photius. Then Photius excommunicated Nicholas, and this whole period's called the Photian Schism. It really, the relations between the East and the West had been souring for a long time, and a lot of people, especially in the East, consider this as the first. This is where in the East they really consider it the beginning of the Great Schism between the Eastern and the Western churches, where in the West they date it more so to a later event. So then in the meanwhile, while all this is happening, Formosus, who will later become Pope, he's the Bishop of Porto, which is a major see. He would have been considered a cardinal at that time. He was sent as an emissary to the king of the Bulgarians. They might call it a nuncio in this day and age. And the Bulgarians, they absolutely loved him. The Bulgarians wanted him to be consecrated as their metropolitan bishop, like their head bishop, and he wanted to be their bishop as well. Or at least he's accused of this, but all the signs point that he did want to be head bishop there. And of course, the Byzantines didn't want a Latin metropolitan head bishop of Bulgaria. Powerful people in Rome also didn't want Formosus to be metropolitan because that was a lot of power for one guy to have. So unfortunately for Rome, because this would have been a major get for them, they really dragged their feet too long on, should we appoint him? Should we not? Should we try and appoint somebody else? Obviously, the time of trying to get people back and forth is a consideration, but all of that added up in the end. The Byzantines were able to get the Bulgarians to accept one of theirs own Greek bishops to be their metropolitan, which that's firmly locked the Bulgarians into the Eastern Orthodox sphere of Christianity, which they're still in today. Now, to get into the technical weeds and canonical weeds, Formosus really couldn't become the bishop of anywhere other than Porto, because there was a canon from the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea all the way back in 325 that popes couldn't be translated, which translated in this context just means they can't do a job transfer from one bishopric to another. That, like bishops hopping around to get from one a better job to another, it's super common today in the Catholic Church, but it was strictly forbidden back then. And you can really see why they wouldn't want you're named the bishop of some place that maybe doesn't have a lot of revenues, and it's not, but you're politically hungry, so you abandon your bishop, your episcopal see that you're supposed to be like the father of, so that you can go get a better job. And then, well, that one, there was actually a guy who had done that, and it was really that canon was made for one bishop who politically he wanted to stay close to power. So, let me get a better job here, better job there. Next thing you know, he's the most probably the most powerful bishop in the in the whole Christendom.
We have this in the modern world in a sense with a lot of times corporate executives, they're called non-compete clauses, right? That if you get a job at, a top investment bank and you leave, you can't go to another top investment bank for a year. And the reason on paper for that is, you may know some secrets about one place or another, but it's really collusion. It's really a way of these banks to make sure that they're not, spending all their time and money poaching each other's people. And because the Catholic Church is sort of in charge of all of these sees, or, there may be influence from the Eastern Church and whatnot. Of course, it doesn't want them, feuding with each other over that, even if it might be kind of in their individual interests. So this kind of complex organizational stuff that we're thinking about today definitely has modern equivalents. Yeah,
a non-compete, that's a great analogy. They were basically, it was supposed to be a non-compete for life, which maybe that's too extreme. And probably that it did need to be modified to some degree, because if you have somebody who's really good, you don't want them locked into something. If they're an able administrator, you don't want them locked into something, maybe a C that's tiny and in the middle of nowhere for life. It kind of cuts your talent pool.
Right. I guess the flip side of that would be if your superstars find the way to the most important spots in a way that you couldn't kind of from the top down organize and stuff like that. But I don't know. Now I'm just being an economist and I'm just going off on tangents here. So we need to get to the Cadaver Synod.
Yes. So we'll just skim through this. That's really where the meat of the problem starts for Formosus, is that obviously there's a subcontext here where I'm sure he wanted to save souls in Bulgaria, but he also wanted a really powerful position. People in Rome knew that. There's a couple of popes. There's a Pope Hadrian II, and he was more of a compromise pope. There's a lot of infighting among the factions in Rome. And that's probably what was really the holdup of getting that metropolitan bishop to into Bulgaria, is that there was just so much infighting. There's in this time period, Formosus had actually been excommunicated during Hadrian II because of the machinations. The next pope, Marinus, he brings Formosus back in. During all this time period, Formosus is actually forming a party, sort of a political party around him. And it's turning into a really important faction inside of Rome. The next pope's important, John VIII. This is also an interesting time period. This is where they place the Pope Joan, the female pope, story. This is one of the places where she gets placed in, and John VIII is one of the ones who they sometimes consider could have been Pope Joan, and that's that was like a smear against him, was that he was a woman. I guess that's a smear that we certainly wouldn't use today, but that was one that they were very comfortable using back then. And it's something that 1,100 years doesn't translate well, I guess.
Paul II wouldn't have been any good.
No.
Wouldn't go there.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, Anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center may not be available in all states, not available in California.
So with John VIII, there was a really ugly battle that was even turned into violence between Formosus trying to get himself elected Pope. Formosus didn't get elected. John VIII got elected. But there was basically back and forth fighting between Formosus's camp and John VIII's event this whole time. This is where the rise of Cyril and Methodius comes up, and they were the ones, they're called the missionaries to the Slavs. This is when the Slavs really come in. This is it's slightly off track, but it'll bring us back around, is that the German clergy hated Methodius. Cyril's kind of the one who gets, Cyril and Methodius were brothers, and Cyril is kind of the more famous one, but he died pretty early. Methodius is the one who really carried the ball on it. These Germans who were really powerful, and they were the ones who wanted to do the homogenization. They really wanted, Methodius was more so, he wanted local churches to use their vernacular language, and he created a Slavonic liturgy. Pope John, the Germans, they went and jailed Methodius and held him for a long time, but Pope John released him and brought him to Rome and became a benefactor of Methodius, which all of this may have made John some political enemies, which got Pope John assassinated. Pope John was the first pope to be assassinated in the first 900 years of Christianity. That's sort of like the flipping the domino over, where now popes are going to get assassinated. Now, there's another Pope Stephen V. We really don't have to talk much about him. He's, again, involved with all these power grabs, and they just keep simmering. He died, and then in 891, Formosus finally gets elected to the papacy. He gets translated as from the Bishop of Porto to the papacy. Marinus, he was actually the first pope to be translated from a smaller diocese to the papacy, and it was by the time Formosus did it, he's the second guy to do it, and it's not considered a huge deal at the time. But Formosus was a really political guy, and he was able to smooth over a lot of the difficult situations that were going on. In the most part, a lot of the previous popes, they had handled these situations a lot worse than Formosus did. He was nominally in the Lombard camp until the Germans came and conquered a lot of the area around him, and then he became nominally pro-German, but he was really good at balancing the powers. And overall, in his 7 or 8 years as 6 or 7 years as Pope, he wasn't so bad. I would say he was probably better than any of his predecessors, up to maybe Nicholas. He wasn't a great pope, but he wasn't a terrible one either.
Yeah, it's this translation thing is it's very funny to me always, as kind of just an outsider who's just fascinated with the history, how hung up on details sometimes this theology will get, in the way that, I mean, we're about to see a pope put a corpse on trial, and yet, God forbid, you should want to take your talents to Bulgaria and be a bishop there.
Yeah,
and it's and that's, I guess, kind of what fascinates me in a lot of ways about this institution, is they're constantly wrestling with kind of taking theology, and because they're such a powerful kind of worldly institution, applying it to the world and having those two things kind of collide. And I think that's a lot of what makes it so fascinating to study.
A big part of it is that the in Christianity, it's never been an institution, at least up until this point, and really in what classical Christianity, it's never been comfortable with having secular and theological power. Even the popes who were basically the prince of a medieval kingdom, they would take off their papal hat when it was time to do secular. So that's why I've never been comfortable calling it a theocracy, because they never treated themselves as a theocracy.
Right. Well, it's almost like the most interesting part is in that little point of friction between not being a theocracy, but having all of that power in the real world, and kind of, what do you do with it? And obviously some decisions have been better than others through history. Yeah.
There was one little pope. There was one little pope. I don't know if he was. There was one short reign of a pope, Boniface VI, who he died within 2 weeks. So it's not very. He doesn't play much of a role, but he was actually the second shortest papal reign of all time, and I think it wound up being about 12 or 13 days. But that leads us up to Stephen VI,
let me actually
the star of today.
Stephen the First. Hold on here. Let me just ask you one question that I was wondering going into this that I couldn't quite find out. Do we know how Formosus died?
I think he just died of natural causes. Okay. Let me see if there's a quick...
No, nobody says it's not an event anybody really talks about. It's it doesn't take much imagination to wonder why. I would think this was.
Yeah, if there was some suspicious circumstances.
Detail, but they may. I wonder if it's one of those things they just don't know.
Let's see here. I want to say I could be just misremembering.
Well, he wasn't assassinated, obviously.
No, there could have been a plague or something. I thought I read that someplace, but there was he was struck with, this is according to the New Advent, which is a pretty good site, struck with a paralysis on the way to deal with with the Lombards.
Polio or something like that.
Yeah, and he wasn't very old, or no, he was pretty old at the time. Okay. So I probably not any foul circumstances, but at this time you don't know.
Well, the most we could hope for Formosus was like a peaceful death in his sleep, given what's about to happen. So
this is pretty much during the summer of 896. Mm-hmm. Now, or wait, 89. Yeah, that would have been the summerish of 896. Right. Yeah. Now, Stephen VI, he gets elected pretty shortly after Formosus's death, which was how those things worked. They would, even to this day, there wasn't huge gaps in the time between papacies. They tried to keep those as small as possible. Yep. Stephen VI was very pro-Lombard, or the Duchy of Spoleto. He was translated from the bishopric of it's an Italian city name, so excuse my pronunciation. Agni, I think is how you say it. And that was a really tiny bishopric, not in the hills outside of Rome. And Stephen didn't really want to be appointed to that one, probably because it was tiny and not a lot of power. Now, it should be said, this is the time period where we're moving from. Usually, the Archdeacon of Rome was almost like the vice pope. And when the pope died, this archdeacon, who was not the bishop of anything, he would be the natural person to get elected. Now we're getting into the time where powerful bishops are going to be moved over. And really, it's Formosus who gets the ball rolling on that trend, which is the trend that carries all the way through today. The thing we can really say about Stephen VI is that he was either a crazy like a fox or a stark raving lunatic. Like, it's really hard to figure out which one he was. And I guess ultimately the people, the listeners out there, are going to have to be the ones who make their own decision on that one after they hear what he does.
Yeah. we will get into several crazy like a fox scenarios in just a few minutes. But I would also say that's not mutually exclusive from being a star-craving lunatic.
Yeah.
He may well have been both.
One way or the other, Stephen absolutely hated Formosus. They were, if it was a personal animus or if it was career, whatever it was, there was a lot of very ill feelings here. But there's really not a lot of evidence to explain to why he hated him to such a degree. This gets us to the actual synod, the Cadaver Synod, which happened in January of 897, so about 6 months later. Stephen charged Formosus with the following counts: perjury, so just generally lying; ambition and coveting the papacy, which, I mean, if that's a crime, everybody was coveting the papacy. So, and then I think it was even listed as various other crimes. So, basically the throw the spaghetti at the wall and let's see what sticks theory of criminal prosecution.
He was accused of the crime of being properly buried.
Yeah. The location of the trials at St. John Lateran, which is the cathedral church of the bishops of the Rome. The proceedings was mostly Stephen acting as prosecutor, and then a deacon who was pretending and speaking for Formosus. So this is probably where we should talk about how Formosus gets into the picture. Before this point, it really wasn't unusual to put to posthumously have a trial against somebody. They had done it a couple of times before to a couple of big names, like Origen of Alexandria. He's a really big name. His name had been sort of tarred a long time after his death, and there's other figures. Not unusual. The thing that really becomes unusual in this is that they actually drag Formosus out of his crypt and put him on a papal chair, dressed in his full papal vestments in the middle of the cathedral. That's the unusual part. And
that's what I was stunned by and can't figure out another historical precedent for exactly is the pageantry involved in all of this. Body desecration, corpse desecration has always, there's plenty of instances of that. I think I remember Sulla's people doing something to Marius in the late Roman Republic. But the ceremony of it all, kind of almost a parody of what the church would do in an actual trial to this dead body. And I think I read somewhere that like all the church dignitaries were there, right? We're like in the audience, like the cardinals and whatever. So, and actually in what we'll talk about in a minute, a lot of it is more about that audience than it is about Stephen or Formosus in a lot of ways. So keep going. Yeah, there's historical incidences and events for any one of these things, but not many where they bring in everything, that's what makes this so awesome. Who might have been the drivers as much as Stephen is the Dutch or the Duke of Spoleto, Lambert, and his mom. I can't think of what his mom's name is. It's probably not. It's not super important right here, but they were actually there when Formosus was disinterred from his crypt. I can't remember where he was buried. That doesn't really matter either. But they were there, so they wanted to be there too, which is very odd. And there's some stories about that. You always have to take the stories with a grain of salt because it depends on who was there to witness it and who wrote it down.
what we can say is a fairly scientific fact at this point is Formosus would have been in what the experts, the forensic experts, call now stage 3 decomposition. With, I mean, he would have, not to be gross here, is he would have been completely covered in maggots, turning into flies, bloating. He would have been liquefying. I mean, it would have been smelly and just generally gross. Yeah. If you look up the Cadaver Synod, usually in Google, the first thing that'll come up is a picture, a painting done in the 1800s by a French artist called Jean-Paul Laurent. The painting of him of Formosus sitting in his chair looks more like a skeleton, like a crypt keeper or Skeletor. After 6 months, he would not have looked like, it would have been a lot more gross than that.
I just picture this artist, sorry, Steve, going through old histories of the church and coming across the Cadaver Synod in the 1800s and thinking, nobody's painted this? Yeah. Like, this is beautiful. This is low-hanging fruit. Anyway.
There's actually a funny, I think it's College Humor, did a cartoon of the Cadaver Synod, and they show Formosus looking more like how we probably would have looked. Yeah. But so as we said a little earlier, Formosus's defense was a very junior deacon, which that kind of says what kind of defense he was getting. And the deacon, actually, he talked like he was Formosus in that College Humor thing. They show him like moving his jaw. So maybe it wasn't that far, but that's a nice
to believe
image.
It.
Yeah, it's a fun image. The proceedings was Stephen just screaming at the top of his lungs at Formosus. That was the whole thing. And then this deacon probably like, oh no, I didn't do that. But behind Formosus, but it was generally just for Stephen just acting like a loon the whole time. And like you said, it's a completely packed crowd of all the top bishops, and they're probably in their full regalia, and you have Stephen just jumping around and just going crazy against this completely rotted out dead guy sitting in a chair in the middle of this. I mean, it just must have been a 3-ring circus.
Yeah, I don't know how to. I just keep going back to in my own thoughts about it, just like this actually happened. This is an event that actually took place. And one of the strangest ones I've ever heard of.
As you can imagine, I don't think we have to, it's not a huge stretch that Formosus was condemned and then excommunicated. Then his body was mutilated after that. He was stripped of his papal vestments, except for the garments that had been close to his flesh, which had kind of putrefied into his flesh. If I'm getting too gross here, the audience, you can tell me. I mean, you might as well. If you're going to paint,
I think this has to be. The picture has to be painted, so to speak.
Then the 3 fingers of his hand where he would use to make his papal benedictions. If you're watching this on the screen, like this sort of thing, if you're listening, you can watch the YouTube that'll hopefully come out of this. Like this sort of thing, they would cut those 3 fingers off. And then his body was tossed into the Tiber River, which was always a really symbolic thing, all the way going back into Roman times, where they would toss. I mean, obviously, garbage and sewerage would go into the Tiber, but then that would also be where tyrants would get thrown into the Tiber. Even in recent times, in 2019, there was a big stink about an idol Pachamama thing. That was a big stink amongst modern day Catholics, where somebody broke into a church and threw those into the Tiber, and he could have just obviously thrown them into the garbage. But in 2020, you make a YouTube, 2019, you make a YouTube of it, throwing these things into the Tiber. But so, that's obviously, it's a thing in Catholicism and in Rome to throw things into the Tiber symbolically.
Gotta love it.
Then supposedly a monk fished Formosus's body out of the Tiber and kind of gave him a Christian burial. the big thing with Stephen is he went and annulled everything that Formosus did during his papacy, which is kind of an odd thing to do. Like, how do you unwind everything that somebody, an executive has done and an administrator has done over the course of 7 years? I don't know how you would think, and have the kind of the guts to say that I'm going to unwind everything that he's done, because obviously that's going to cause organizational chaos. Yep. But that's what he did. But there might have been a very good reason for him to do that. For one, that's an easy way to get rid of the pro-Formosus clergy. If you say that they're not clergy and they're not bishops anymore, you can easily kick them out and then fill those ranks up with your partisans. It was also convenient personally for Stephen because he had been appointed as bishop of Agnus by Formosus, which that actually annulled Stephen's own appointment to bishop. So technically, he didn't translate from being bishop of Agnus to the papacy. So that kind of gets rid of that crime that you could say, or that uncanonical thing that Stephen was doing. He's not breaking that 15th canon, which some people still held fast to. So that was, in that way, that was really a win-win for Stephen. Now he's coming in completely clean. He can sweep the deck clean of pro-Formosus people and, basically start over with a completely clean slate.
Yep. And that's, I think that again, some of those, the fact that there are all of these factions within the institution, within the church, that are favoring different outside influencers, favoring different papal candidates. Obviously, some of that conflict is a huge part of what arises out of this. But why don't we kind of tie up the end of this, and then I can talk about that a little more.
Now now we can get into the aftermath of the synod and get into some interesting ideas where you can put your economist hat on. Yeah. Basically, in the historical record, Formosus gets fished out of the river. The next pope overturned entirely the Cadaver Synod and reinstated all of Formosus's appointments and his proclamation. So what Stephen had wiped out, the next pope brought all back in. The pro-Formosus party clergy, what had gotten rid of Stephen as pope, is they eventually just killed Stephen a couple of months after the Cadaver Synod. This is almost sounding you're getting little hints of how Roman emperors worked. As soon as they turn their back, they'd make a big play and then get executed themselves. There was a lot of back and forth between pro and anti-Formosan parties in the years after this. So really, Formosus, he had made a big stamp on the church. Another pope a few years down the line re-condemned Formosus and possibly desecrated his body again. That one's kind of that one has a little bit of legend attached to it, so it could have been true, might not have been true.
It's like the writer of the sequel getting greedy and exactly. Totally implausible.
But it really, I think that's more indicative of how much this was the dividing line of Formosus had really made a party that had some staying power. This is where we transition to something that's called the pornocracy period of the papacy, and it's really the time where this is the ugliest period of the Roman papacy. A lot of people if you in the modern day, people bring up examples of popes behaving badly. They'll bring up the Renaissance popes like Alexander VI of the Borgias fame. But the things that these popes do in the 900s and the 1000s, really in the 900s to the 1000s, that's the stuff that would make Alexander VI blush. Like, we're going a little too far here, guys. And they didn't, at least the Renaissance popes, you can say that they brought us some of the most beautiful art of all time. They're the ones who, any of the famous churches you would go to in Rome, that's what those guys did. These popes, they nearly wrecked the entire organization of the papacy. And it really would take really strong reforms in the towards the end of the year of the thousands to get back to, to get the papacy back onto an even keel. So we're really talking about the Cadaver Synod is what brought in just a completely terrible period in the papacy.
Yep. So I guess it's time for me to bring in some thoughts as an economist here. And obviously there's no sort of one right way to think about something like this. This is a historical event that, like we said, kind of lacks precedence almost, at least in its kind of combination of crazy elements. And there's obviously just a ton of history and power politics and theology and real honest religious belief that are affecting this. But I guess that's sort of what I enjoy. I kind of enjoy wading in the kind of shadows of complex things and stuff. And, I guess just to set the table, I don't even want to describe this in great detail because I'm worried it almost might offend someone, but think about the current pope putting 2 popes ago on trial in this way. Just think about that event happening. And, maybe people would say, oh, the current pope is a nutcase, but nobody would have ever let him do it. Right. Mm-hmm. He would, go dig up this guy and who you revered and put him on trial. And people would have said no. So what's that audience doing in this room? And I'll talk a little bit about Stephen and the sort of crazy like a fox idea, which I think is very plausible. And then I'll talk more kind of institutionally about the church and how, as economists, we might think of that. So I'm going to bring in a whole bunch of different things and just kind of different kinds of intuition from things like game theory and what we call institutional analysis. Don't worry, there's not going to be any math. This is one of the few rooms here in the Institute where we do not have a whiteboard, so I can't get up and bust out equations. But so Stephen, so why might Stephen have, obviously he didn't think it would result in, or he would, be killed a couple of months later. If you don't mind,
I'd just jump in one
Yeah, please.
As an economist, I mean, I think most of the listeners here know, but money probably will come in, and if it comes in at all, a lot of people confuse economists with financial advisors. So
Right.
We're really not economics is really more of the study of decision making than it is anything to do with really like monetary issues as such as like actual money.
Right.
Maybe you can explain that a little more.
Incentives and how people respond to incentives. And, if we're really doing it right, how do those responses and those actions, turn around and affect the next round of what people are doing and deciding? And that's a huge part of it, too. So, Stephen, the crazy like a fox theory, I think normally it would be somewhat analogous to like what the Kims do in North Korea when they put on these gigantic stadium-filled displays and they have all this weird mythology. As some analysts will say, they're showing the world we might be crazy enough to drop a nuclear bomb on somebody if we're provoked. If you send troops over the border or something. So, yeah, in some ways, this might have been Stephen saying, I am so out of my mind that I will credibly, kill you, ruin your afterlife, put on this spectacle, just to keep people in line. And sort of in game theory, a lot of times they'll talk about making that threat credible. And this is certainly a way to do it. And there's a subtle kind of other angle to that, which is called signaling in economics and in game theory, would be more like Stephen saying, going through something that's not even good for him, that's costly to him, but not so costly that he can't do it. And in fact, by doing it and showing that it's not so costly to people, he's saying something. And that's maybe more about his grip on power. Now, of course, this failed in the end, but, he may have been saying to all those people in that audience, I have such a tight grip on power that I can do this absolutely obscene, beyond the pale thing, and I'm still going to be Pope tomorrow. And so how on earth are you going to unseat me? Those are just kind of strategic incentives, and those should be in the back of your mind when we're talking about sort of the wider, what I'll call institutional context. And this is, game theory is something where economists use a lot of math, write down a lot of equations on the board. Institutional analysis usually is more what we would think of as an older style of economics, although one that we do a lot of at AIER. That's really more about intuition and thinking about history and that type of thing. So a lot of the real action is here.
Yeah, I think that this is a really interesting part where I don't think that I've read this in a lot of history books. I don't think that this is, I would love to see historians using more of this thought process of how humans act, because this is where it boils down to, and you'll get into this a bit more, of the great man versus trends type situation. This is where the rubber hits the road, and this is why I'm really fascinated to hear what you have to say about this. Yeah, and I'll maybe talk a little bit about the end, why maybe these subjects haven't talked to each other quite as much as they should. So you just talked about humans acting, and one thing to keep in mind when we're thinking about an institution is that in the end, at the end of the day, right, it's only human beings that take actions. It's individuals that take actions. We might, as shorthand, sometimes find it convenient to treat an institution like it's something that's acting, but really it's composed of, thousands, millions, hundreds, whatever, of people who are all making their own decisions and responding to the same things. So, that sounds maybe a little esoteric until you think about it's actually quite profound, because think about how often, people will say something like, well, the Catholic Church doesn't want this to happen. Or, or people who distrust kind of billionaires, Wall Street is going to rig the system. Or, people who distrust government will say, well, the state's never going to give up on power. And all of those things are really obscure a lot of understanding when we step back and we think, well, there's a lot of human beings in there, each making their own decisions. And so that really brings us to another kind of way economists have of thinking about political institutions, governments. Usually this is done in kind of political science and in thinking about small d democratic governments, but we can apply it here too. That's called public choice. That it basically says at its core, right, governments, in this case, the Catholic Church, are composed of lots of people. They each have their own incentives. They each have their own knowledge, their own information. It's structured in a certain way, right? And that often leads to outcomes that we wouldn't expect. And that often is a constraint on governments and institutions having one will and kind of one purpose. And that gets caricatured a lot of times to say, oh, government is bad because everybody's looking out for their own self. But that's really just a fact. And that can be, and no matter kind of what your feelings on government and politically, this is a good way of asking how these things function. Basically, if we think about this institution with lots of actors, with lots of people with their own incentives, right, it's now evolving in a way with everything around it, with other institutions, with governments, with people making specific decisions, important decisions like the Cadaver Synod. This kind of coevolution of the institutions and everything around them is is changing what's at stake here. So when the Catholic Church was founded, right, well, it was the throne of Peter, at least, as the history would have it. And at that point, if you're Pope, you're
like probably going to get executed by the Roman authorities, or you're going to have to live underground or something in the beginning. This is not a position that many people would covet unless they are, spiritually kind of oriented in that direction. By the time we've gotten here, there is no Roman Empire. There is no power over Western Europe. As Steve said, there's not a theocracy, but there is this institution that has in some ways absolute power over what people believe at a time where what people believed was a lot more kind of literally hewn to this stuff than maybe some people now. So this is an extremely coveted position, right? And it's not at all a surprise that we're going to start seeing internal factions, that we're going to start seeing assassinations, intrigue during this time. Just to look at it on the other end in history, a lot of the positive things that democracy has given us is it's kind of lowered the stakes again in a way where people don't have absolute power. People don't have, and if you notice, listen to any history podcast out there and you will see whether it's the papacy, whether it's whatever monarch, there's people killing each other over who's going to go next, like every two people, right? And so you notice that in democracies, that's, mostly replaced by Russian meddling or, Supreme Court decisions about hanging Chads in Florida and that kind of like that may be bad, but that's not as bad as, the assassinations and wars that were fought throughout most of history. So all of that to say that who is going to be the next pope, especially during this time with this power vacuum, is an extremely brutal business. And we can expect people, again, maybe not individuals, to be tyrants and say, I'm going to kill everybody. I'm going to put on this insane spectacle. But when you're involved in these pitched battles, these things, that tends to bring these things out in people.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Hello, I'm David Jeremiah, here to remind us that America's 250th anniversary is more than a milestone to celebrate. It's a moment to remember. We remember the blessings of God and the gift of freedom. We need also to remember the responsibility that comes as a result. A nation is not held together by prosperity alone, but by truth, virtue, and the character of its people. And if we are to leave this country strong for those who come after us, then we must pass on more than just history. We must pass on faith. So let us thank God for His goodness to America and ask Him to guide us in the days ahead. May God bless America.
Yeah, I think it's, if you look in the history of the United States, just as an example, 4 presidents were executed in 200 years, and none of those were it wasn't explicitly the opposite political faction killing the other one so that they could get their person in there. That's, there's a difference in, the way people can exercise power that's not acceptable anymore.
Right. Exactly. And that's an interesting, the not acceptable kind of part of this. And the fact that, and I think a lot of what maybe prevented people from saying no to Stephen, I wonder, I'm curious, and I don't have an answer to this, how much of it was the belief system at the time. And, and we can't get into these people's heads and, this sounds strange, but this is obviously what God wills to happen if the Pope is doing it, right? If the Pope is infallible, and how much is just fear about one's personal safety and somebody having a chokehold on power. So that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I think that there's probably has to be people, you throw around that term, the perfect storm, but this probably was this, for an event, a really one-off event to have happened. Every single piece of the puzzle had to fall in place perfectly for this to happen.
Right. And whenever I kind of laugh when I talk about the great man versus the trends and forces thing, because I've never heard anybody talk about it without saying, well, that's not really a binary choice. I'm somewhere in between. And of course, everybody's somewhere in between. That makes perfect sense. But that really, this kind of institutions evolving kind of along with each other and on these kind of complex paths where perfect storms happen that you can't predict. This is another way of this is sort of economics in a way, and political science kind of wrestling with this great man trends and forces type of debate. And a lot of times in our field, I think we fall short in that the sort of hyper mathematical approach that I was trained in, that most economists, to be honest, are trained in, really misses a lot of this stuff because you can't really write it down as a math problem. It's too complicated.
Yeah, it's the human factor that you just can't. It's humans and it's organizations. These organizations that become organisms on their own, where they get this culture and that is generally hard to change. But sometimes that right person can come in and change part of the culture that changes something else. That's probably what we see here with Stephen, is that maybe there wasn't that other person there to just say, hey, Stephen, calm down for a minute. We can put him on trial without actually digging him out, which they probably, even if they had put Formosus on trial spiritually as such, they still may have dug him out of his grave and thrown him into the Tiber. Right. But they wouldn't have had that whole spectacle of him propped up in the chair, which that's really the part that makes it. We go back to that. That's the over the top part of it.
Exactly. That's the part that you're like, what? And right, because so John Wycliffe the heretic, and like the later on in the Middle Ages, in the late Middle Ages, I think Phil actually pointed this out to me. That they dug him up, but it was more of a digging him up and throwing him in the river kind of thing than it was kind of this spectacle. I was going to say before, when we were talking about kind of public choice and everybody having their own incentives, that one of the really kind of profound outcomes of that hopefully, if just one person hears this and keeps in mind when you're thinking about kind of other events in politics and things, is that you can have bad outcomes in complex, big organizations without somebody bad having done something to cause it. Now here, look, there was something bad. There was some, and we can say Pope Stephen was pretty bad and had a big hand in causing this, but when we think about everybody else sitting there and letting him do it, for instance, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were cowards or they were brainwashed or they were bad people or things like that, right? These collective interactions tend to take on a life of their own. And so Friedrich Hayek is my favorite economist, probably, talked about emergent order and emergent outcomes, mostly in the context of markets. But we kind of see that here, too, with the relationships and the connections, that we can get weird looking stuff happening out of not necessarily some, evil intent kind of right from the beginning.
Another thing that really I think that I didn't understand quite as much is how much pressure everyone was under at this time, especially at this point with the Saracens or the Muslims, when they had a foothold right in southern Italy. This is the time where Spain was almost entirely Islamic, where Rome was not, no place in Italy was safe from being raided at any time from the Arab armies. This is also the time, it was a few popes before Formosus. King Alfred of England fame had lived in Rome for a while. This is the time where the Vikings completely took over England. So there would have been people, there was a strong Anglo-Saxon community in Rome. They would have been getting information from their friends and relatives in England that England's done, that it's been completely taken over by pagan Vikings. That's a lot of stress on these people, that their entire world, not only their religion, but the fabric of their society is ripping apart into shreds. That's a lot going on.
Yeah. And I think that's perfect, because I think that's the last kind of chunk of ideas that I wanted to talk about were the sort of external influences on the church right now. And, note what Steve just said, that, right, there's people living in Rome is exchanging information with places probably still in the Dark Ages more than anybody else, because it's got that church there. And, right. And so people, there's a diverse group of people there. They're hearing things from home. They also, in addition to hearing things from home, are getting messages of, see if you can get control of, this part of the church, and that's going to help us leverage these people, and that kind of thing. And that has a definite analog to something that kind of goes on today almost unavoidably, which has a kind of bad name in economics called rent seeking, which doesn't sound like anything. But really what it is kind of established, usually big corporations, kind of leveraging the power of government and regulators for their own gain, kind of co-opting. And one sort of ridiculous recent example of it that's really over the top was the Amazon was going to build its second headquarters in New York because it had this big reality show about who was going to give it the biggest personal tax break. And the leaders of New York won. Now, usually it's not actually sort of turned into a commercial like that. Usually that stuff's a little bit more hush-hush. But again, it doesn't have to be corrupt people doing corrupt things. It can come out of the fact that people know each other better, who are, business elites and government elites and that kind of thing. But again, here we have this, sweet pot of gold in the middle that is this kind of theological power, if not, de facto power in the world today. And that's going to lead to fights when you have this fractious environment out there where everybody else is fighting.
I think there's another economics angle that doesn't get applied as much by historians, because maybe it's still a controversial within economics, from other economics things I've read, is that people don't always act on perfect information. Right. That they might be acting in their best interest on things that aren't necessarily true, or they're misinterpreting them in a way, so that they're still maybe acting in their self-interest, but it's not off of good information. Right. And that's something that really speaks to different kinds of economics colliding. And just to go off on a little aside for listeners, if you're interested, most of the field today is very based on mathematical modeling and very based on finding something called equilibrium, which basically amounts mathematically to solving equations and things like that. It becomes very hard to do the math when people don't know certain things or think like humans in certain ways, basically, rather than sort of deducing every layer of kind of truth around them. If you kind of relax that and you try to make people not know things when you do all this math, it gets way too complicated way too quickly. So kind of ironically, the only workable solution usually to more complexity is actually less complicated math, right? And in the end, really going back to intuition and really kind of structured intuition and where we can kind of be serious about what do we and don't we know, but that's not just hand wavy, but that isn't just writing down equations. There's other economists who will do other kinds of modeling with computer simulations and agents and people that maybe behave more like you're talking about, Steve. But in the end, what's going on here, and this is maybe, I think, why history, at least from the mainstream of economics, hasn't seen much to incorporate itself, is economics is a hard subject. I was so pleased. I got one of my friend's fathers, who's a physicist, who's been a tenured professor his whole career, and I got him to admit that economics is harder than physics.
because now maybe not mathematically, because maybe in physics you can do more of the math. But he said, yeah, I want my little closed system where particles are hitting from this and that, and I know exactly where everything is. He said, you don't know. And so a lot of I think our challenge in the field today is figuring out how to be more concrete, how to teach people in that kind of more complex tradition that kind of honors that, but finds a way to not just be sort of everything at once and just, waving our hands. And that's really hard.
To wrap up today, the conversation, you've kind of mentioned how economics and psychology and history, all these different areas of the academy live in their own silos. What's a way that maybe they can all work together more to understand more about each other's? Because it sure seems like there's a lot of ways that all these different structures could work together. And departments could work together so that as a people we can understand everything better.
And so let's go back to kind of institutional analysis, and let's look at individual people in these institutions' incentives. If I'm a senior faculty member who has done, in any of these disciplines, who has done things a certain way my whole career, I'm going to probably end up hiring people who do things my certain way. And whether that's ego, whether that's just kind of expediency, whether that's who you kind of know through your network and it's your friend's student from somewhere. I think that's the biggest thing that perpetuates these silos and often makes them get further and further away from each other. It's almost, Steve, like if the department chair is elected by the assistant professors and then selects the new assistant professors. What does that remind you of?
Yeah. Do you think in the modern age where there's a lot more academics working outside of universities, that there's maybe a chance for more of these interactions to happen?
I think there is and there does. And I think that a lot of AIER comes out of a tradition in economics that is more open to history and other things. But then there's politics that get in the way of people talking to each other. And we'll save that for another day. But it's I think that ultimately what might do it is people like you. Is the internet and people podcasting and talking to each other. And it doesn't feel like, you having me on and talking about this is a big deal, and it's not going to trigger some cascade of things, but maybe it's kind of just one little point of many things that just gets people talking to each other more and gets those gatekeepers kind of out of the way.
Yeah, I think that's where, obviously I'm not a professor of history. I'm using what historians have done before me and trying to make it into something entertaining for other people. Right. And that's why I can bring on people like you and bring on, other scholars. And I think, like you said, it's a more relaxed environment. And maybe that's why there's a lot of debate why more professors of history don't, or professors of anything don't do a podcast about that, is because then they can, trip into a field of landmines that can get them in trouble with what pays their bills.
Right. I used to work in the private sector and do kind of economic consulting for expert testimony, and there's all these lawyers, and you become, between that and getting a PhD and being in academia itself, you become incredibly paranoid about, with often good reason, about what you're on record saying. And my guess is these historians don't have any incentive, don't want to give anybody all the extra surface area of them talking for an hour of what they say. But again, these new understandings and influences and things can arise out of lots of little interactions like this. And maybe that's the answer.
I think that's a great place to wrap up this holiday present. If people want to learn more about you and AEIR, where can they find that?
So let's be very careful. AIER.
Oh, sorry, I really tried hard.
It's an old acronym. But three vowels is tough. AIER. AIER.org. That's the American Institute for Economic Research, so AIER.org. We have daily content that is really kind of 3-page or so articles that are really kind of commentary and research that is aimed at not professional economists, but people like Steve who are interested in economics and that kind of thing. And so if that sounds like it might be interesting to you, check it out. I write about half of my time about technology and actually probably bring in a lot of these ideas similar to history in the way I think about that. And that the other half of the time I'm writing about policy and a lot right now about the presidential candidates and their proposals. Spoiler alert, I don't like any of them. So you'll have our article feed there. So I would just suggest going to our website. We're on every social media as well, but I would start there.
And I definitely hope to have you back on, Phil Magnus, Jeffrey Tucker. If there's anybody else and you meet in the lunchroom who wants to come on.
Maybe we'll have a panel with the three of us one day, although I don't know, Jeffrey and I might try to compete for like the who gets the most face time.
But you're any of you are always welcome on any time you want. This I've very much enjoyed talking to all of you. Yeah, it's been cool for me to be listening to this podcast and then be able to kind of contribute to it. And that's kind of, again, like I think what we were just saying. Yeah, that's great. And if people have questions about this or they have other show topics, definitely send them to me at steve@a2zhistorypage.com. And I want to thank you again, Max. Right. Happy holidays to you and to everybody out there.
Merry Cadaver Synod.
Yes.
When the world is just too much, turn it off and turn on positive, encouraging K-Love.
I'm gonna praise.
World off. K-Love on.
K-Love is sunshine for my soul.
I love K-Love.
Listen now on your radio, online, or on the free K-Love app.
K-Love makes me feel so good.
Positive, encouraging K-Love.
Hi, everyone. If you've been injured in an accident that was not your fault, listen up. We have legal professionals standing by to answer your questions for free. Call now and find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth. Call 800-910-7500. I'm here with spokesman John Wolf. So, John, tell everyone listening who should call right now.
Well, Maria, first off, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to answer the listeners' questions. Now, as far as who should call in, anyone who's been injured in an accident and think you deserve compensation, give us a call right now. 800-910-7500. You'll find out if you have a case and how much it's potentially worth.
Thanks, John. You heard it, folks. Take advantage of this opportunity and call now. 800-910-7500.
Advertisement sponsored by Legal Help Center may not be available in all states, not available in California.